Okay, I think it's a little past 4, so we'll get started. Welcome to the third Fairbanks Center Modern China lecture of the academic year, the last one of this semester. My name is Arunabh Ghosh. I teach modern Chinese history in the history department here. I also convene this lecture series. Today, I'm delighted to welcome to Harvard and to the Fairbanks Center, Professor Selda Altan, who is assistant professor of history at Randolph College. Professor Altan is a historian of modern China and also teaches Asian history. She received a PhD in history from NYU in 2017, and her undergraduate and master's degrees are from, get this right, Boğaziçi University, in Istanbul. She has also spent extensive amounts of time in China, both for language work and then for research. Before joining the faculty at Randolph, she also taught at Swarthmore College and at the University of Florida. She's the author of a fantastic book with a fantastic cover, Chinese Workers of the World, Colonialism, Chinese Labor, and the Yunnan-Indochina Railway, which was published earlier this year by Stanford University Press. The book is a history of the construction of the Yunnan-Indochina Railway, which took place from about 1898 to 1910. And Selda focuses on Chinese labor under colonial regimes, sort of an inversion of the ways in which we often look at labor, to show how that experience was a crucible for Chinese ideas of free labor, national sovereignty, and a whole range of other things, which, of course, we're going to hear about. So I'm not going to say much more about that. But what I will say is that Selda will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A for about half an hour, 40 minutes or so, depending on questions, planning to end by about 5:30 at the very latest, maybe a little earlier. Okay, so Selda, a very warm welcome again, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here today, and I would like to thank Professor Arunabh Ghosh for his kind invitation and Mark Grady for facilitating my trip. It's a pleasure for any author to share their work with their, fellow scholars and grad students and undergrad students as well, because you usually provide excellent feedback, because a project is never a done project. You keep thinking about it forever, maybe for your entire life. And, I came to visit Harvard University Library today, and I was still looking for books on Yunnan. It's kind of an obsession for me right now, but I feel really lucky to be here today to, hear your feedback on the book. And I know that it's a very exciting day for everyone. It's the election day, and thank you so much for coming here. I mean, maybe this will be a great pastime for you until you hear the results. So today I'll be talking about my book, as Arunabh described, Chinese Workers of the World, which was published by Stanford University last June. So it's quite recent. The book examines the history of the railway constructed by France between China's southwestern province of Yunnan and modern-day Vietnam, then a French colony known as Indochina. Although Yunnan was not a popular destination for foreigners in the 19th century due to its rudimentary transportation infrastructure and relative isolation from the rest of the country, this changed in the 19th century when foreigners gained the right to travel deeper into China beyond treaty ports. Yunnan soon became a region of rivalry between British and French colonizers. By this time, Britain had established dominance in India, Burma, and Tibet, while France was focused on developing its relatively new colony in Vietnam. So it was not only the colonial governments, but also French explorers and merchants who proposed building a railway between Tonkin, northern Vietnam, and China, because these figures were captivated by Yunnan's untapped resources, particularly its minerals, to the point that their misconception about the region was later referred to as Yunnan myth by scholars. They believed Yunnan's mineral wealth, opium production, and proximity to China's silk-producing regions would enrich the colonial economy and give France a strategic advantage over Britain. This intercolonial rivalry intensified when Germany acquired territories in China's northwest, and this prompted France to ask for concessions in the south adjacent to its colonial holdings. So as a result, on April 10, 1898, France and the Qing government, they signed a treaty authorizing the French government, French Indochina government, for the construction of a railway. However, the project faced significant delays and local resistance, and construction did not begin until 5 years later in the middle of widespread uprising against foreign encroachment in Yunnan. Here on this slides, you can see, first of all, this area was quite challenging. And as soon as French engineers and survey teams, they arrived in Yunnan, they realized that the region was very difficult. They had to change the original route they planned because it's a very mountainous area. And they realized that indeed initiators of the project had underestimated these difficulties. So one of the other difficulties is the malarial climate, and the other difficulty is the sparse population. So the reluctance of locals to work on the railway led to the recruitment of laborers from other Chinese provinces. However, many of these workers, when they came to Yunnan, they either immediately died from malaria, or they immediately left those work sites because they realized the working conditions were not acceptable. Despite all these, here again, it's an image I would like to show, because this was an engineering achievement for France. This railway was built right after Eiffel Tower was also built, so they are using similar metal infrastructure. And at the very end of this project, of course, they were very proud of their modern engineering. So despite all these challenges, the railway was completed in 1910. You see an image of the celebration here, but unfortunately not without a significant human cost, including the lives of approximately 12,000 workers, mostly Chinese, but also Vietnamese. So when I examined the existing scholarship on this railway, I noticed a lack of work in English. French scholars had studied this railway extensively. Not too much. There were a couple of scholars dealing with this issue, and they usually took a very critical approach because this railway never achieved the promises. Initially they were expecting a lot, maybe some colonization in the region, but in 1945, towards the very end, at the very end of the Second World War, France gave this railway back to China without fulfilling any of its promises. So they called it simply a failed imperialist project. Chinese scholars, on the other hand, focus mostly on the railway's role in international relations. So French Qing government relations were definitely a central theme. And they also focus on its legacy in the sense that it introduced some modern ideas and technologies to a peripheral province in China, and it still symbolizes the region's colonial past. So if you go to Yunnan today, you will see many museum exhibitions. There are lots of beautiful books published about this railway because luckily one of the French ambassadors here, he was interested in photography, so he took lots of photographs. So in terms of images, this project is quite rich, and Chinese scholars are building on this legacy as well. My book, on the other hand, takes a different approach by focusing on the construction process from a labor perspective. It examines the railway as a key episode in class formation, shaped by the intersecting forces of nationalism, colonialism, and capitalism. Here I will show you briefly the table of contents. Here you see I indeed structured the book to reflect the dichotomy that encounter between the French and Chinese sides. The first chapter starts with French imperialism and the reasons why they initiated this railway. In the first chapter, I have an extensive discussion of opium trade and how French was expecting to benefit from this. In the second chapter, mining is at the center, and also French efforts to manipulate the local Muslim ethnic communities against the Qing government. The third chapter, I should say, is the core of the book because that's where I discuss French labor recruitment efforts in different Chinese provinces and how Chinese laborers navigated this process quite successfully. In the fourth chapter, I focus on the process I call racialization, and I found in French medicine and jurisdiction in Yunnan. In the fifth chapter, I go back to the Chinese side and try to understand how Chinese nationalists approach the railway and how they solve this difficult process as part of their nation building project in a peripheral province again. And in the sixth chapter, again, I continue the discussion about nationalist activism, completion of the railway, and also a nationalist uprising in 1908 against the Qing government. Before I delve into the other issues in the book, or the main arguments in the book, I would like to say a few words about the process that led me to this topic, because I think it demonstrates how our assumptions and established notions can evolve over time. I grew up in Istanbul in a working class neighborhood and grew up in the middle of labor protests, picketing, and lockouts. So studying labor was quite natural to me. So there's nothing surprising about it. But my interest in the Yunnan-Indochina Railway specifically emerged during my research in China when I was writing my master's thesis for Boğaziçi University. And my master's thesis was about Chinese-Ottoman interactions in the late 19th and early 20th century. Initially, I was hoping to find some maybe international relations, but I realized that indeed those relations were very limited. So I was looking more for individuals who traveled between these two countries and maybe created some kind of connection. So when I was doing that research, I found a contemporary article in a British magazine. And I saw this news that there were some Ottoman workers employed on a French railway in Yunnan. And this was quite shocking to me because at the time I was a master's student and my understanding of China was obviously very limited. But at the same time, I knew that China had always been known as a country of abundant labor, right? And inexpensive labor. And I was so surprised to hear that some people from the Ottoman Empire traveled all the way to China to be employed on a railway. And this was in a way contradictory to what I knew about China. So I decided to pursue this question, and I wanted to write a PhD dissertation about it. So it turned out, as a master's student, my understanding of Chinese history was limited to the scholarship produced based on information and archives coming from China's East Coast and treaty port cities. And if you look at those narratives, you see that definitely there was an ongoing coolie trade on China's East Coast. There was definitely an abundant source of labor, supply of labor in those areas. There was a very dynamic economy, commercial, and newly industrializing. And cities like Canton, Fujian, and Xiamen, they were hubs of global labor recruitment for China. But then I realized that Yunnan was very different from the stories I learned about China. As I started working on my PhD project, I realized how diverse China was in the late 19th century. And I also realized that labor market on those East Coast cities was also forcefully created by colonial powers with the two treaties signed after Opium War. So when we discuss Opium Wars and those unequal treaties, we focus so much on those international relations, China losing its sovereign power. But if you read those treaties carefully, indeed, a major portion of those agreements also, concern laborers and their immigration to overseas colonial territories. Again, another thing I learned was that Yunnan, contrary to those East Coast cities or provinces, was among China's poorest provinces and least populated regions. And it was characterized by ethnic diversity and mountainous terrain. And it had a subtropical climate and also a malarial climate it meant. So it was the core of China's mining industry, but even in that sector, out-of-province recruitment or out-of-province investors were coming and doing a lot of mining. So this discovery indeed helped me explain why the French builders of the railway faced a formidable challenge of labor shortage, necessitating the recruitment of workers from other provinces. So the story of the railway, as I would later uncover, extended beyond Yunnan's demographic and geographical peculiarities, and I will delve into this topic shortly. So again, before proceeding, it's important to address the terminology I'll be using in this presentation, particularly the term coolie. I'm fully aware that this term has been used in different contexts, often in a derogatory sense. So I recognize that this terminology may be sensitive for some, and I sincerely apologize for any discomfort I may cause here. But my intention is to engage with this historical term critically while acknowledging its implications. Historically, Euro-Americans used the term coolie to describe Asian contract laborers working under specific labor arrangements. In my research, I examined the role of these laborers as precursors to the modern Chinese worker, operating within political and economic systems shaped by colonialism. I argue that the identity of the modern Chinese worker evolved within a racialized framework established during this colonial period. Therefore, using the term coolie is essential for highlighting the racialization of Chinese labor, which is a key contribution of my book to the field. Indeed, coolie trade has been a popular topic among scholars, and these books are all great examples on this topic. This area of study, it's particularly situated within the realms of Chinese migration and diaspora studies. So they usually operated separately from Chinese labor history. So we have a huge Chinese diaspora studies, especially for Chinese immigration to Southeast Asia. But these days, we also have Asian American studies because Chinese migration to the US is also significant. So there is a big literature about that, and coolie trade here is very important because there are all sorts of discussions about slavery here. Then we also have a big literature, not so popular these days, but in 1970s, 80s, I think this was a very popular topic. But, whenever I go to conferences, I see people doing presentations about Chinese labor. So I guess, at some point we will also have a new scholarship on Chinese labor history. But Chinese labor history does not have any connection to this diaspora study. So we have, again, these excellent examples, and these books are my role models for sure. Especially, Gail Hershatter, it's just a legend. All these works are excellent, but what my work does is to connect these two separate literatures. So I'm asking this question, how can I bring that diaspora studies, Chinese labor migration with Chinese labor history? So I specifically look at this relationship between these two fields. So let's go back to Yunnan. So then what I try to do in this book is to examine the global coolie trade, so Chinese labor recruitment for overseas colonial projects, how this labor recruitment model served as a blueprint for European railway projects within China. And then I try to explore how they function differently. So I compare these two systems. Here you see these worker contracts signed by French recruitment companies, the railway company in particular, and I look at similarities and differences. So when confronted with labor shortages in Yunnan, French railway company and its Italian contractors, I tell you, it's a very interesting story because there were not enough French investors or contractors interested in going and building this railway. So Italians undertook the project. So when they had this difficulty, they took this overseas coolie labor recruitment model and they started to work with Chinese and European intermediaries in China to recruit workers for a project again inside China. So this strategy used the same terminology, same method, and same contracts of the coolie trade. And it shows us this intersection between global and local labor recruitment processes. But despite the similarities, the experiences of workers in Yunnan diverge significantly from those abroad due to their employment within Chinese sovereign territory. So what happened differently in Yunnan? When you read the contract terms, you will realize that for overseas workers, the conditions were usually more difficult because they are in a foreign territory. It was not easy for them to go back to their countries. They were bound by their contracts, but also they were bound by shipping, companies. And in some instances, they were not even able to find ships to go back to China, even if they desired. So in many instances, those workers abroad were committing suicide if they found their working conditions unbearable. Whereas in China, in the case of Yunnan, because this is China's sovereign territory and it's a familiar geography, they were able to leave the work sites and go back to their hometown, sometimes walking, thousands of miles, but still it was possible for them to go back. Or again, because they're inside Qing sovereign territory, they were able to talk to their governors, officials, and ask for their help. And with the intervention of these officials, then they were able to leverage their position and negotiate better terms. So there were significant differences, and workers inside China, coolies inside China, were definitely in a better position compared to their peers abroad. So in the third chapter in particular, I focus on the difficulties encountered by French agents. And we know that by the time they were looking for workers in those southeastern cities, there was already a well-functioning labor market in those areas, and people from rural areas coming to those towns, and there were kidnappings as well, but they were signing contracts with colonial powers, sometimes at embassies, and getting the approval of the Qing officials, then they were able to leave and work abroad. Unfortunately, their better position inside China did not translate into an idyllic experience. Indeed, still the region was a very challenging geography. Foreigners were enjoying all sorts of extraterritorial privileges. So especially Italians, Italy at the time did not have a diplomatic treaty with China. So those Italians were turning abusive very easily compared to the French. So all these adverse conditions resulted in the death of thousands of workers. And this picture was even more complicated around 1908 when nationalists arrived, and then Qing government also became more oppressive towards workers. Indeed, I argue that this tragedy was an outcome of the process I call the racialization of Chinese labor, and this is a global phenomenon. This term refers to the European perception of Chinese labor during the colonial age. So while inexpensive Asian or Chinese labor was a necessity for the development of capitalist infrastructure of Euro-American capitalism, the discovery of the discourse of the yellow peril or Chinese exclusion laws shaped European perception of Chinese workers. So in the US and British and French colonies, Chinese workers were seen as a threat to white working classes because of their so-called submissive work culture, or because they were content with lower wages. So combined with a general racism toward Asian people, European politicians, diplomats, and employers tended to distinguish Chinese coolies from white working classes. Here I get my inspiration from Cedric Robinson and his theory of racial capitalism. He argues that capitalism is inherently a racial system. In other words, without racism, capitalist economies wouldn't be able to maximize labor extraction in colonized territories. So here I try to say that racialization was the condition of the exploitation of Chinese labor. Again, let's go back to Yunnan and see how that racialization process worked in this local setting. First of all, as I said earlier, I looked at medicinal and judicial practices. For example, because of the railway construction, many doctors were employed by France, and they opened a hospital and they had clinics along the railway. Because a statement from the book, or a Swiss engineer was saying that workers were dying like flies. So doctors were serving in the area and they were creating reports about the local circumstances. And when you read those accounts, you see that they were, those reports were contributing to this racialization because, for example, they were saying things like Chinese did not have any notion of public hygiene, prostitution was very common, sodomy was very common. I mean, you get this information from these doctor reports. Another part or another aspect of this racialization was the criminalization of Chinese worker actions. So instead of seeing those workers or coolies as workers in a European sense, these European employers were making statements like, for example, workers were staying in their tents because they were not feeling healthy. The climate is so difficult. But engineers or contractors were saying that, oh, these people are not good for hard work. Hard work is not good for their, it's not even fit for their genes. So they were making these culturalist and racist statements about Chinese worker experiences. And again, because of this racial capitalism argument, what I tried to say is that they were racializing and culturalizing all these economic encounters. So from these examples, again, foreigners are enjoying extraterritorial privileges. If they killed anyone, if they killed workers, they were exempt from punishment. So many people were escaping to Hanoi, Vietnam, whereas when Chinese committed a crime, then they were subject to extreme punishments. And these workers were committing crimes because sometimes they were not paid and they were asking for their payments. And in some cases, they were killing their employers. So what I try to say is that Europeans were criminalizing those actions because in their eyes, Chinese workers were not workers in the proper or in the European sense. So this brings me to the second line of inquiry in my book, because obviously Yunnan Railway project was an imperialist project, but then how Chinese nationalists and Chinese government officials reacted to this project in general, but also to workers' misery, because this was almost a scandal in China at the time. Thousands of workers losing their lives. They are protesting. They are leaving the work sites, and there were even protests in other coastal cities for the specific railway project. Unfortunately, I have to say that I was not able to go into the provincial archives. I mean, I was able to go to the archive, but of course, they did not show me the collection. Nothing surprising. Late Qing collections were closed to researchers when I was there. Later, I inquired again, but it was not possible. Luckily, they published some documents from the archive, so I was able to use it. But more specifically, I used this publication from that time period. This is Yunnan Journal, published by Chinese nationalists affiliated with Tongmeng Hui, the Revolutionary Alliance. So I found a selection from this journal, and I use this as a source to make my arguments about Chinese nationalists. So this publication was published in 1906, and it was in circulation until 1911. Until the Chinese Republican Revolution, and it was widely circulating in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, and China, and Japan as well. So this part of the research helped me revise my understanding of conventional narratives about late 19th century, early 20th century China. First of all, we had that notion that Qing government was entirely weak by this time, especially in its dealing with foreign colonialists. But my research suggests a different picture, particularly in dealings between Qing China and France. Far from being merely passive, the Qing administration employed a strategic approach of leveraging foreign powers against one another. And this was a common practice in the Qing bureaucracy. So when they gave France the privilege to build that railway, indeed their purpose, they were making an intentional choice because they did not want any single power colonize the province. So they were creating a power balance in Yunnan. And also they were hoping that foreigners building a railway in Yunnan will bring some new technologies and bring foreign investment to the region, because earlier they had tried introducing those technologies, but they were not successful. So they thought that foreign presence will bring those new technologies, even in mining industry. Of course, there were reactions, but that was their expectation. So here, when I look at the sources, I realize that the Qing government was not as weak as we tend to think. They were making some strategic decisions. And again, the Qing government, they also understood the importance of land and labor as fundamental components of China's sovereignty. When they signed the railway treaty, they specified all the details of land purchases by foreigners, and they also specified the regulations for labor treatment. So, of course, the statements were a little vague because by this time we don't have a labor law in China. But in all these international treaties, there was a statement of fair treatment of Chinese workers. So they knew that indeed those aspects, those two things were essential for any sovereign nation. Indeed, contrary to their anti-government position, Chinese nationalists also had a very similar approach to the foreign railway projects in China. So just like Chinese officials, they also thought that land and labor were key to build a sovereign nation. And nationalists, they also recognized the disadvantages of the province because this province is particularly poor. There is not enough capital to invest in any type of industrial modernization. So they also believe that indeed foreign investment could be beneficial in this situation. Where their views diverge was in the perceived purpose and potential benefits of the railway or the railways in general. So while the Qing government considered the project as a means to maintain its dominion and extend its influence across the country, nationalists focused on the survival and economic revitalization of Yunnan, hence China. So they believe that railways will create new communication tools, transportation tools, modernize the economy, and will create national unity in China. And this is definitely the essence of their nation building project. But Chinese nationalists did not envision, of course, railway building means that you have native capital and a bourgeois class is emerging out of this. But what they envisioned in this new bourgeois class was not something conflictual. So they are seeing Chinese workers, they are encouraging the emergence of a bourgeois class, but they think that their new bourgeoisie will not be greedy and they will look for, they will be an altruistic class and they would work for the benefit of the nation instead of pursuing their own self-interest. So that was the expectation. So they decided to use the plight of workers, not just as a critique of foreign imperialism, but also as a strategic tool against the Qing administration. So workers were suffering and they were creating a very emotional narrative around that. And, speaking to the public sentiment and nationalist feeling. But at the same time, they were avoiding to create any kind of class conflict between these two different groups and not highlighting workers as the agents of a revolutionary project, for example. Here I mentioned put these two figures. Li Guoyan was one of the founders of the Yunnan Journal and affiliated with Sun Yat-sen's Revolutionary Alliance. And Sun Chunxuan, for example, was the governor of Tu Liangguang. And he, for example, in 1908, he banned recruitment for the railway because workers were complaining about their conditions, not receiving their payments. So he banned the recruitment and let the recruitment or lifted that ban only after the French railway company deposited a significant amount of money in a Cantonese bank so that workers could be paid with that money. So indeed, Qing officials were also working to protect the interests of the workers. So in this evolving discourse on national sovereignty and development, Sun Yat-sen is a very prominent figure. He was getting some inspiration from Euro-American models of progress. And in his view, capitalism was the natural path of historical development, while socialism could be used as a corrective to its excesses. So this perspective was reflected in Yunnan Journal because it was inspired by Sun's ideology. And they opposed foreign land appropriation in Yunnan because they were also interested in the question of inequality, and they believed that foreign purchases of land in Yunnan would be a major cause of inequality here. So Sun Yat-sen had a unique understanding of, I think he put land as a central theme because he was a Georgist, but I don't want to go into that discussion. And other Tongmenghui affiliated scholars also argued that selling land to foreigners were against capital accumulation in China because they believed that foreigners were purchasing those land, making improvements, and then selling back these lands to Chinese or maybe renting them and making higher profits, whereas Chinese were not benefiting from this process, and this was impeding the process of the development of a national bourgeois class in China. They also had a holistic understanding of economy, so they did not focus on one aspect, but they thought that all these economic activities were interrelated and they should be analyzed and understood together. So you cannot, for example, prosper just by investing in your mining. At the same time, you need to invest in your railways infrastructure so that you can carry those things, and all other economic activities were seen as part of this whole. And their understanding of railway investment was also a reflection of this holistic view. And they believe that nationalization of railways, in the sense that local native capitalists would build them, that was a good strategy. And the Qing government should be, the government, not the Qing government, the government should be in charge of protecting the interests of the nationalist bourgeoisie native capital against foreign competition. Once those fair circumstances were created, then Chinese market will find its natural course and will function properly. So they were not entirely opposed against foreign railway investments because they believe that Yunnan is too poor. What can we do? Those foreign investments will benefit us. So this of course does not mean that they were not anti-colonial or anti-imperialist. Indeed, this Yunnan Journal was particularly anti-colonial and anti-imperialist because they were just living next to Vietnam, and Vietnam was already a French colony. And when they look at the Chinese, the labor force along the railway, they realized that Vietnamese were subject to more cruel treatment compared to the Chinese, because Chinese workers were still under the protection of the Qing government, whereas the Vietnamese were entirely subject to French rule. This might be a rhetorical strategy. Honestly, it's hard to say which of the groups was having a better time on the railway, but that was the argument. So they were making this argument that indeed colonization of Vietnam was a loss of national identity, and that future was possible for China too. So they were making this call to the Chinese people in Yunnan to work together to avoid the fate of Vietnam. So that, because Britain was in the region, France was in the region, colonialism was still a very imminent threat here. So in crafting their anti-colonial narrative, Yunnanese nationalists foregrounded the exploitation of labor, and they wanted to create that sense of solidarity with Vietnamese. And there were indeed actual contacts between Chinese nationalists in Japan and Vietnamese nationalists, anti-colonialists as well. But what they did here was to prioritize land instead of seeing workers as the agents of a real struggle. Because from a nationalist perspective, what required for a national struggle was some kind of nationalist consciousness, which usually comes with good education, or maybe, people with certain amount of money, those elites could have that kind of consciousness. So in their understanding, workers were definitely, they deserve to be equal subjects in this new nation, but at the same time, they were not seen as agents of history in this process. And this is, again, a reflection of their understanding of politics. And I should say it's a limited understanding of politics. So the nationalist movement in Yunnan culminated in a major uprising in 1908. Sun Yat-sen was organizing small-scale rebellions in southern parts of China. And this is just one of the links in that big chain of uprisings. They mobilized some Chinese in Vietnam, and they crossed the border, and they took control of the city of Mengzi, where we had the largest foreign population. And if you look at Chinese historiography, they will tell you that this uprising was against French colonization of the province. But what I saw in the archives was entirely different. As soon as they gained control of Mengzi, Chinese nationalists, they proclaimed that indeed they will not touch any foreigners, and they will protect the property of foreigners. So Sun Yat-sen was making a very pragmatic decision. He was he was really good at diplomacy, always negotiating with foreigners and seeking their support in his efforts. Later, we will see the same thing in 1911. Again, when Yunnan had the Republican Revolution, they did exactly the same thing, and announced to the foreign population that you will be protected under our regime. So indeed, that Chinese historiography approach is a little problematic, and indeed, this rebellion was targeting the Manchu government specifically, and they were trying to overthrow the Manchu government. But then the rebellion lasted around a month, 26 days or so, and French troops also helped Qing government suppress this rebellion. So this episode reveals the complexities of nationalist propaganda in Yunnan, which, while vocal about the exploitation and suffering of workers, did not fully capitalize on their potential for historical agency. The limited participation of workers in the uprising suggests that the nationalist message, focusing on worker misery, may not have resonated deeply enough to galvanize widespread support among the labor force. I contend that this was a natural outcome of nationalist ideology, which was predicated on the belief that political agency should reside with individuals endowed with a certain level of education, capital, or nationalist consciousness. So from a nationalist point of view, while workers were definitely entitled to equal rights as citizens, they were not yet recognized as a distinct class with interests different from those of the emerging bourgeoisie, at least until the creation of a unified national economy. So to conclude, the story of the Yunnan-Indochina Railway was definitely a complex one, nothing simple in history. Researching these topics changed my views on a lot of topics. For example, Chinese surplus labor was not there, easily accessible to foreign bourgeoisie. That market was created through forceful mechanisms of imperialism. This, however, does not mean that imperialism was a flawless ideology. I mean, you understand what I mean. Always making progress toward colonial expansion or economic exploitation. The colonial machinery was full of conflicts and vulnerabilities due to the involvement of actors with varying interests. Thus, the Chinese government was not an entirely incompetent state with no power to protect its borders or people. Although they were weak militarily, they were able to play colonial powers off against each other quite successfully. This helped the country build a basic industrial infrastructure until most of it was destroyed by the Japanese occupation. As much as officials ignored workers and peasants as actors of national politics, Chinese nationalists also highlighted them as the vanguards of a revolutionary struggle because they believed in the necessity of a class coalition to build a strong nation. In the middle of everything, workers were giving a struggle for their lives and well-being on a global scale, not only dealing with their own bourgeois classes, but also with the world bourgeoisie. In the sense, they were not the workers of China, but instead Chinese workers of the world. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Selda. That was really fascinating. I'll throw the floor open in a second, but maybe I can start off by asking a couple. I have basically two questions I want to ask to kick the conversation off. The first has to do with two events towards the end of the time period you study, which is Kunming becoming a treaty port in 1908, and you talked about extraterritoriality. My impression was that you talked about it being present already earlier. So in some ways, how is that, what exactly happened there? And what impact did Kunming becoming a treaty port in 1908 have with relation to some of the things that you're looking at, Qing agency, sovereignty, and its ability to influence events? So that's the first event. The second event is 1909 when the Kunming Military Academy is established, which actually then creates, at least in theory, a military presence of the Qing there itself. And it goes on to have, it's a fairly influential military academy going forward. So I'm wondering what sort of how you understand these two events in relationship to your story and how it affects understanding labor. The other question, which is more a curiosity because you mentioned it as a way as your own entry into this project, is what happened to the Ottoman labor. We did very little about it. So if you can tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I will start with the Ottoman workers. So those were not the Ottoman workers I was expecting to see. I was expecting more traditional, Muslim Ottoman workers, but it turned out that the contractor company who undertook this project were a family with a Greek origin, and they were, from Europe, and they were, collecting workers in that area. And those Ottomans were indeed former Ottoman subjects, now maybe subjects of, independent Greece. And so many Greek, indeed, individuals were involved in that project. So they were, I think they were, foreign press was using these terms without paying attention to those details. So indeed, they were not Muslim Ottoman workers, but mostly people from Eastern Europe, Italy, and specifically Greece, because the family, Vitali family, was in charge, and they had their origin in Greece, and they had earlier built railways in the Ottoman Empire. So Salonika railway was built by the same company, and later Congo railway will be also built by the same company. So we have very similar stories coming from Africa. And indeed, in some parts of the book, I draw those parallels between Africa, and because, the project itself is very similar, but I will not go further with this. So indeed, I was definitely looking specifically at this railway, and this railway was coming toward completion even as early as 1906. 1906 was particularly successful at the time. For some reason, they were able to find a lot of workers. And as you see, by 1908, the railway was functional and carrying soldiers and, troops. So what I can say about that transition in around 1908, 1909, now more foreigners were interested in the area. So those Vietnamese, for example, as they came and settled, they started opening, shops and groceries and restaurants. Italians were becoming more influential. Indeed, French were complaining about how they lost the ground to the Italians, because now the Qing government, this time to counterbalance the French, were signing treaties with Italy, recruiting Italian medical doctors, for example, because they were more eager to work in this area. French, honestly, they were not interested in, living in this difficult part of the world. I think around 1908, 1910, the province was becoming quite cosmopolitan with all sorts of, foreigners. Now there is that convenient railway and more foreign investment coming, and banking and everything is becoming really great. Military academy, again, it's something the Qing government, local government, was negotiating with French, and France was hoping that they could be the leader in this initiative. But again, whatever that's why people see this as a failed project, because France couldn't, take root in this province. Qing officials simply, they did not like the French officials. They said, okay, French is an unknown language to us, so we will instead invite Germans and Japanese, and we will work with these Italians. So by 1908, French diplomats were talking about, maybe we should sell back this to China because this will not bring us anything. It seems like they were even saying things like, when these Qing officials, when they have their celebrations, they are drinking Italian sparkling wine instead of champagne. So they were very disappointed with, what they did. They were not, financially this was a disaster too. The cost increased by 74%. So they had to spend so much money. This was such a costly investment. And by the time railway was completed, French was simply losing everything. They had to, give back those hospitals. They had to give back those military. They couldn't send any instructors to the military academy. They simply failed in this imperialist endeavor. So the scene was not so great for. That's why I'm saying, imperialism is not that straightforward. When you look at the specific locale, you can find all sorts of, challenges and conflicts.
So one of the other legacies, of course, of this project is that it gave China its first hydroelectric station.
Oh, really?
But that's a different topic. But the floor is open now. So if you could quickly identify yourself, that'd be great.
Hold the microphone medium.
And you can also, if you have a question, just sort of signal to me secretly, and I'll put you on a list here, so we can keep it smooth. But yeah, June, yeah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I loved it, and all the photographs. I can ask you all the questions. One thing I'm wondering if I should read your book, but I think at the same time, China actually, there are several railway projects going on. It's cross-border. Have colonial imperialist background. You have the Kowloon-Canton Railway, you have Chinese Eastern Railway, and you have this Yunnan Railway. Do you see patterns that share or different patterns in terms of recruiting and regulating all the labor practice or not? Or maybe it's just beyond the scope. That's totally fine.
So yeah, indeed, this railway is the second one. So Eastern one was the first cross-border. I think this is the second one. And this is a 1 meter. So it's a narrow railway, and it's the method they used in difficult geographies. It's more convenient to build. I think there are parallels in terms of labor recruitment. But, because my access to Chinese sources was limited, I approached this question from more, French archives perspective. And when you look at the issue from this perspective, French was just so terrible at building railways. Seriously, I think, there was another railway they were planning to build in Guangxi, and then they got the concession, but they couldn't build it. And again, it was all about their conflicts. So these businessmen and French diplomats, they simply couldn't get along. They couldn't finalize things, and they were always fighting with each other. When I was reading those documents from the archive, it's just such a People's Magazine type of thing. People always complaining about each other. I think British were doing maybe a better job, and maybe Northern Railways were, maybe more important, I should say, compared to this. This is, again, it's a very, peripheral region, didn't promise much. But from my perspective, I think French were not great.
So thank you so much. Another smaller question would be about ethnicity. Since you're talking about, I think you mentioned by passing, I think the difference maybe between, say, the Kowloon, the Canton one or the Chinese Eastern one would be the ethnicity diversity of the region, and how I believe this region, even today, will face the not only geographical extreme diversity, but also the population-wise. I wonder if that, kind of creates certain patterns in terms of labor issues and how the French and the Chinese government actually dealt with it.
Yeah, I think the ethnic composition here was very complicated. But the thing is that those local ethnic, indigenous people, they were not willing to work. Simply, they were living their free lives on the mountains. Why should you go? They knew the area, they know the dangers, so they simply did not want to work. I think the recruitment was successful only in times around Chinese New Year because people had to pay their debts. So then they were going and working for the railway for cash money. But otherwise, especially indigenous people were not willing. So the local government was, enforcing some local villages and ethnic villages to go and work for the railway. But even then, they were going under usually a chief, and they were doing all sorts of, rebellious stuff as they were employed. So ethnic composition was very complicated here. As I said, workers initially, for example, Chinese government did not want Vietnamese workers, and it was in the contract. But later, because they couldn't find workers, they had to recruit from Vietnam as well. And then the company was creating that ethnic hierarchy using Vietnamese guards as guards, railway guards, instead of, putting them at work. So that part was complicated.
Yeah, that reminds me of Emily Honeck's works about Subei in Shanghai and how in the middle they use ethnicity to create hierarchy.
And French was hoping to, again, as I said in the beginning, was trying to manipulate the local Muslims because, they thought of themselves as a great Muslim empire, French empire is a Muslim empire. They, played into that role of, Pan-Asianist policies, and they tried to manipulate those local ethnic, Muslim communities. But again, I'm sorry I do not want to offend anyone here, but their understanding of Yunnan and those Muslim communities was so wrong. Seriously, they brought 5 Algerian soldiers to Yunnan, hoping that those Algerian soldiers will make some influence on those local Muslim people. I don't know what they expect, but it was another scandal. So I think compared to the British, French understanding of the region was very limited. Whatever they understood, it was a misunderstanding. So they all played into this failure.
Thank you so much.
Richard?
Thank you for this wonderful talk. Since you worked a lot with French materials, I have 2 questions about some kind of French relation. One is you made a claim, I think, for Keren College of Holy Cross in here. You made a claim for this kind of the strength or agency of the late Qing in its negotiations with the French. I'm wondering, look at the materials in La Courneuve, if it goes back to the self-strengthening period, it's on the French War.
Which period did you say?
The self-strengthening period.
Okay,
self-strengthening argument, because that's the kind of argument those of us who work on the self-strengthening period have been making, right? So it's a kind of continuity. And then going forward, is our continuity in terms of the racialization of Chinese labor by the French or others with, say, just a few years down the road, the China Labor Corps in France during World War I. So that's the first question. The second one, I'm trying to read the book. I'm only a couple chapters in, but you didn't talk about the Lyon Chamber of Commerce. And I'm interested in kind of the regional kind of travelers and people who are in China, in Southwest China at this moment, and the role that they played in these projects, but also were they responsible for the bad knowledge about Yunnan? Is that
So the beginning of this entire thing is indeed the Lyon Chamber of Commerce. They sent a mission. So what happened? There was a sick worm crisis. A disease in Europe. So they were looking for cheap raw silk in China. So they sent a mission to China in 1895. That mission came specifically to Yunnan, but more specifically to Sichuan. So they went through, they created the initial information. And indeed, the main initiator of this project, Ulysses Pilla, is affiliated with Lyon Chamber of Commerce, and he is in the silk industry. So indeed, yes, that's the beginning of everything. But this mission, yes. This happened around 1895. So the agreement was signed 1898. Even around that time, they did not have exactly what to do with this. They had this initial idea of a route, but later when engineers came, they realized that, again, that route was inappropriate. Would not work for them. It would be very costly. So yes, indeed, they were responsible for the Yunnan myth. and creating this misinformation about the region. But they had, really capable people in the mission. Some were experts in silk industry, some were experts in other fields like, metal work, mines, etc. But I think when you study this region, we have a lot about Lyon mission, and it's easily accessible. And that's why I did not want to spend a lot of time in my book about that project. So yes, I mean, honestly, I believe that historiography is changing about agency of the Qing state. And this is, yes, indeed, this is exactly the time period Qing was trying to, strengthen itself and reform efforts. And I see its reflection in Yunnan province, because at the same time, they are trying to consolidate the power of the central government exactly around this time, and trying to eliminate those local chieftains and things like that. So that also is working against the Qing government. So the local gentry is becoming really uncomfortable with those, Qing interventions and centralization efforts. So the nationalists indeed are speaking to those, groups here. Yeah, I think honestly, I'm not following the historiography on that, self-strengthening argument. But yes, indeed, the same process continues during the First World War, and we have exactly the same arguments during the war. Numa treating us like cattle and horses, seeing Chinese workers as cattle and horses. That's a very common feeling in China. And that's why I'm making this argument, trying to make this connection between Chinese overseas labor experience and Chinese class formation inside China. It's really hard to find that connection, but when I read all these things, I see that feeling. In China, people were aware of what was going on in the world. They had that information coming to China, and I think that played into their identity formation in this time period.
Thank you so much for your excellent talk that I learned a lot. So I'm a postdoc here, and I have two questions. The first one is because I'm studying the emerging changes, and I use a lot of the sources to talk about the Chinese document. And one thing I found really interesting is about the French Jesuit missionary archives. So as I was reading those archives, I found that in Shanghai, for example, they are always circulating the reports from other places in China, including Yunnan.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of reports to Shanghai. So I just wonder, I mean, on your archival works, whether, the missionary reports, either Catholic or Protestant ones, would be useful, or how much you would integrate them into the bigger picture. My second question is also about the timing. So, we know that till the end of the 1910s, there are so many changes. And one thing is like in 1949, when the Qing government set the new legislation on Chinese nationality, especially to dealing with that kind of overseas Chinese labor. So I just wonder, because you mentioned that this specific timing is until the 1910s. So how much there could be a difference before 1909 and after 1909 on dealing the working contract with those Chinese laborers and also other foreign laborers in China?
Foreign laborers in China?
No, sorry. No. Because sorry.
So Chinese workers in other places? Okay, I guess. Okay. So yes, indeed, when I look at French archives, there were also collections about missionaries. They are usually a separate category, and Catholic missionaries played a very important role to create that information. But I think, again, from my understanding, British Protestant missionaries were providing more information. And French diplomats here, the ones especially I was reading, are not religious figures. And many of them are quite French Republican, ideals they had, and they were very sympathetic to Sun Yat-sen's revolutionary movement, some of them at least. As I said, those Catholic missionaries were providing information, especially about local incidents, but they were not at the center of any conversation about this railway in particular. But they were, in British case and French case, they were very helpful because they were the ones interacting with local people, speaking local languages. So they were very important. But in this particular project, the conversation was going on between the railway company, its contractors, and French missions and different consuls in different cities in Yunnan. A major part of my discussion here is about the changes in Qing perception of immigrant labor.
Yeah.
So before 1909, I think around 1906, even earlier, Qing government started sending missions abroad and surveying the circumstances for Chinese workers employed in Cuba, Peru, in those locations. So they were particularly interested in this. And there are, I think, two reasons for this. One is that they realized that in this new international or globalized world, Chinese workers were the basis of China's sovereign powers as a nation. So they were the source of Chinese sovereignty. So for that reason, they were taking initiative, sending government missions and, giving signal to those governments that, these are our people. We are just lending them to you. They will come back. Another part of this is the money brought by Chinese workers, because Chinese workers were employed abroad usually for temporarily. And many of them, they aim to go back at some point, and they always send their money back to China. Indeed, those recruitment companies also encourage them to, created systems to force them send their money back to China. That's another story. But that money was also very important for China. Even, until 1940s, 50s, the money sent by Chinese workers from abroad, from Southeast Asia, from Americas, everywhere, that money was very valuable for China. So for these two reasons, Qing government and later Chinese governments were really interested in the well-being of Chinese workers abroad. And that's how they situated themselves as a sovereign nation in this new global world.
Next up, Ruslan over here.
Thank you so much. Ruslan, postdoc fellow here at Harvard. Fascinated with your talk and with my own kind of experience of doing field work with Chinese Muslims. I was wondering with regard to your argument about the, in a sense, failed project of empire, French Empire. I kind of the ethnic dimension of this, that one colleague of mine mentioned, kept me thinking about the Thomas Mullany's work on the ethnic classification project and the French roots of it. That the historiographers and ethnographers in China used the French kind of classification in Yunnan to argue for the socialist classification. So I was wondering about the afterlives of the empire beyond the labor issue. 1949, nationalization comes in, and the Yunnan Tin, for instance, is the biggest world company of tin production in China still, right? Which has its own colonial roots also in the French imperial project. So I was wondering whether you walked through these railroads right now and how you see the kind of the ongoing relationship or the afterlife or the legacy of that moment kind of spilling over and taking another different life today in contemporary politics. And then another kind of probably another spin of it, right? I wonder if so Thomas Mullany talks about how they kind of the French classification project was employed by the socialist ethnographers. I was wondering whether there is then a connection of that classification project itself being about the labor issue, which is a kind of adds another spin into the world labor politics that you're talking about, and also kind of an interesting understanding of the classification project of socialist China in general. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, this is, I think, exactly what I'm obsessed with these days. Now, of course, I would like to see what happened next. Yes, one of the things I would like to highlight here is the racist and racial thinking in the 19th and 20th century. And French played a major role in this. Again, in the archives, you see those explorers traveling around and creating immense information about local ethnic communities. Again, some of them are misleading for their own purposes, but even today, they provide really valuable information about their everyday lives and things like that. Honestly, yeah, we can find those roots here. I don't think I can make any statement about the, socialist, People's Republic of China using those categorization and, how they do that. It will be beyond my expertise because I'm not a historian of People's Republic of China. But labor part, I'm not sure, what you mean exactly with many of those mines in Yunnan, tin mines in particular, were used by Muslim, local Muslim, and also people from other provinces. So their activism was also very important. And French, when they invested in those, they also had a treaty about mining, but that was also a failed effort in 1911. The Chinese government, as a result of popular pressure, they had to take back those rights. So Chinese Muslims were a laboring group and a very dynamic laboring group, and they always had conflicts with the Han miners. And indeed, the rebellion in 1875 was very much about that conflict between Muslims and Han Chinese miners. But I'm not sure how this played into the categorization project later. Yeah, I'm not sure. Again, I don't want to make a statement about the PRC period. But it's a good question that I will be thinking a lot. Yeah, these days, what I try to do is to make that connection between this particular experience, this time period, and how it affected class formation and socialist movement after 1920s. So yeah, that will be my next project, and I try to make that connection more explicit and look for sources. Hopefully next year when I'm in China, I'll work on that.
Great. Your question from Shauri over there? Okay.
Thank you. All right. Thank you. Hello. Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I'm Sherry. I'm a PhD student in the energy department, and I'm really curious about the contracts that you talked about, especially the one I'm not sure whether it was the workers who signed them or the intermediary parties who signed them. So I'm really interested in learning more about the contracts, what kind of sources do we have, and how was this contract signed? Did, for example, the workers themselves sign these contracts, and was it fingerprints or footprints, or how was it? Yeah. So I'm just really curious about it.
So this coolie recruitment started in 1847. So by the time they were doing these contracts in 1903, for example, it had been in use for so many years. So those contractors, those intermediaries accumulated a great deal of information and expertise in that. And there were companies specializing in this, both foreign. Those foreign intermediaries were working with local intermediaries. And those, there were, as I said, in 1850s, there were kidnappings, forceful, people were tricked into overseas projects. They were hoping to be employed inside China, but then they were taken overseas. But by this time, by 1903, it had a good structure. So what happened, those companies, they work with locals, and they would take those workers to either the French embassy or the Qing government office. So the contracts were in multiple languages, and the translation was read to the Chinese. So they were not reading themselves, but those, officials were reading them. They were understanding, and under those officials were witnesses. They were writing their names.
Right.
I haven't seen fingerprints. Usually they were using characters and writing their names. I think officials were writing them, and it was usually considered a proper signing of a contract. And then again, there were all sorts of guarantees, but usually they were not well protected, of course. That's why we had such a big tragedy here. So, on paper, things were working, but when they arrived in the field at the work site, things were difficult. They were not that protected.
Do you have a follow-up or?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
go ahead.
Can I answer that question? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for the explanation, because I was thinking that one of the booklets that you show, like the contracts was from Fuzhou. And then I'm also thinking about the land contracts that we can see from the Fuzhou area. So like, I guess like the
Fuzhou is not an accident because Monsieur Vetch, there is that particular recruiter. He was one of the, his company was an expert. He was doing recruitment for French plantations in Réunion Island and in other places as well. Fuzhou was a major site during the building of the Panama Canal. So around this time, that recruitment was going on. And French diplomats were worried that this scandal will affect their recruitment for other projects. So indeed, coolie trade is a flourishing business by this time. But there is government protection now. It's not like as brutal as 1850s. But yeah, Fuzhou is not a coincidence. They are doing recruitment for Mexico and Panama Canal and all those things.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I think we'll take one final question and then we can wrap things up.
Thank you. My name is Yu Han, and I'm a second-year PhD student at School of Education. I work with migrant worker at home in China on educational issues. And I actually should ask the first half of my question is how they sign the contracts, because I was thinking like they are probably illiterate, a lot of them at that time. But the second half of my question is, you talked about they are not seen as agents of change themselves. But I'm wondering on the project with this big of a scale, and there is like, sickness far away from home and different groups recruited from China. I wonder if there is any sort of worker union from the ground.
So I think, again, that's part of my argument here. So what I tried to say in this book overall is that Chinese workers had their tools and mechanisms to protect their interests. So indeed, it was Chinese officials and Chinese nationalists, and more than that, European colonizers. They underestimated the power of Chinese workers. They hoped that, we will go to China. Oh, there are so many Chinese workers. They're all recruited for overseas project. We will find cheap labor in China. They did not understand the market dynamics inside China. Again, what I tried to say, Chinese workers were aware of the global labor market. They knew that, slavery was abolished. Now there is this great demand for inexpensive Asian labor. So they knew their position, they knew their leverage, and they used this to their advantage. And initially, for example, in Southeast Asia, they were called labor gangs, but those, labor networks were eliminated by colonial governments, Dutch and British. They eliminated them because they were asking for too much. For example, funerals was a major concern. Those workers, when they died abroad, those networks were asking for their funeral expenses. And this was, they were causing so much trouble to those colonizer governments. So by implementing certain laws, they eliminated those gangs. And here, for example, for Chinese workers coming to the United States, 6 companies was a major company and protecting the rights of Chinese workers here in the United States, because Chinese exclusion laws were targeting Chinese workers specifically, not merchants or students, things like that. Workers were the main target. In South Africa, we have the same situation. So indeed, Chinese workers were quite organized. They had labor networks. And when they were recruited for Yunnan Railways, again, they were coming under the supervision of a chief. So they had their leader and they were staying together to protect their interests. That was unexpected for foreign colonizers. And that's what I try to highlight here. All these political actors, colonizers, nationalists, and government officials, they underestimated worker agency. But indeed, these people were defending their rights through extreme actions, sometimes killing their employers, sometimes stealing their money, and sometimes petitioning, sometimes, asking government officials to intervene. Even if we cannot talk about class consciousness in a, conventional sense, these workers were aware of their rights. They were aware of what's changing in the world. They were aware of the global labor market, and they were taking action based on that information. That's why I'm making this agency argument here. Thank you for helping me clarify my thoughts.
Great. Well, on that note, please join me in thanking Selda Altan